Good morning, everybody. We're very excited to be offering our very first webinar on carbon capture and storage, blue hydrogen, and other false solutions. So today, our panelist is Ben Hunkler, who's going to speak to us about what his organization, Ohio River Valley Institute, has been working on. We're calling it Addressing False Solutions, Ohio River Valley Institute Research on Blue Hydrogen and Carbon Capture. And so Ben is a communications lead with ORV, an independent, nonpartisan think tank promoting shared prosperity, clean energy, and more equitable civic structures in Appalachia. And so I'm going to turn it right over to Ben to let him get started. So thanks so much, Ben, for being with us, Ben.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. Really appreciate you all having me here today, and I'm excited to talk about some of our research on hydrogen and carbon capture. So we'll launch right into it. And first, let's start with the basics. So what is carbon capture? Essentially, carbon capture refers to technology that's used to collect and compress carbon dioxide from point sources, which include power generating facilities, industrial facilities, and other high emission sources. You might hear carbon capture referred to by many different names. It has several acronyms, including CCUS and CCS. But these essentially refer to the end destination of captured carbon. So once you capture it from a point source, what do you do with it? Where does it go? In theory, carbon dioxide collected from these facilities can be stored underground beneath rock layers, within salt caverns, or even within depleted oil and gas fields. And of course, that storage is something that comes with a whole host of public health and environmental risks. We don't know, what could happen if these carbon pipelines were to rupture, or carbon has also been known to leak from these pipelines as well. So this presentation is mostly going to be about the economic side of carbon capture and hydrogen, but I'll also address some of these public health and environmental concerns as well, because there are a lot of them. Once carbon is captured, it can also be reused in a process called enhanced oil recovery, or EOR. This is a process that mostly takes place in Texas and along the Permian Basin. It's not used as much in the Ohio River Valley or in our part of the country. But what this refers to is essentially taking carbon dioxide and injecting it into low-producing oil wells to stimulate that oil production. So it essentially kind of creates more pressure in the well to draw out oil and gas. And of course, this process will only create more carbon emissions, right? So even though we are capturing carbon emissions from point source facilities and not only reducing them there, we are then creating more carbon emissions elsewhere along the life cycle chain. Here's a little diagram that shows how carbon capture works. So on the left here, you have your point source facilities, which include power plants, manufacturing, and industrial activities. Carbon capture is then taken from these facilities via pipeline, and it can either be stored or sequestered underground or reused for enhanced oil recovery. What's important to note is that carbon capture isn't a proven technology. It hasn't been used effectively or efficiently at scale. And oftentimes, it seems like carbon capture is in the news a lot lately, but it's not a new technology. It's been in development for more than 40 years and has received over 15 years of government subsidies for research and development. Even still, it's not used today in any large American power plant. NRG's Petronova coal-fired power plant in Texas is a great example of this. So this power plant was essentially heralded as kind of one of the first users of carbon capture technology, but it failed to meet its carbon capture goals for several years in a row and eventually closed in May of 2020. A new study also recently came out from some researchers in the Netherlands that found that 32 of 40 carbon capture projects they reviewed actually resulted in increased carbon emissions. So the bottom line is there's really no guarantee that even with federal investment in carbon capture, that it can work effectively to decarbonize our economy or even really effectively reduce carbon emissions. At the Ohio River Valley Institute, we've also taken a deep dive into the financials of carbon capture. We released a report in October of 2021 that essentially asked if we were to introduce or retrofit every power plant in the United States with carbon capture technology, how much would it cost? And we found that implementing CCUS in the nation's power system would cost $100 billion per year. That adds up to $1 trillion over 10 years. And that massive cost would likely end up in your electric bills. So we found that the cost would raise annual household electric bills by more than $293 on average. We also created this map that goes state by state to essentially determine how much your average electric bill would increase if carbon capture were adopted in the nation's fuel system. So if you take a state like Pennsylvania, for example, its 2021 average annual electric bill was just under $1,400. If we incorporated CCUS into Pennsylvania's electric system, it would increase by 19.2% to nearly $1,700. And as you'll see on this map, states that have a higher share of oil and gas in their fuel mix would see even higher increases. So West Virginia, for example, would see a price increase of more than $700 should CCUS be introduced in the power system. Go back to my PowerPoint here. Another big problem with carbon capture, maybe the most fundamental, is that it essentially prolongs emissions in fossil fuels. Carbon capture is a false solution that doesn't effectively decarbonize the economy, rather, and instead prolongs oil and gas production. Carbon capture means more fracking, it means more drilling, and it means more both carbon emissions and the hazardous air and water emissions that result from fracking as well. And of course, it's a trade-off too, right? So carbon capture development would also block the expansion of clean renewable resources. It would take funding away from developing an electric grid that's powered by wind and solar. And it would also leave unaddressed hazardous pollutions that result from these point sources like power generating facilities and industrial facilities, which include nitrous oxide and volatile organic compounds, really hazardous to human health. And carbon capture, it isolates carbon, but it doesn't reduce those other forms of air pollution. Lastly, carbon capture would add few or no permanent jobs. So once these facilities are retrofitted with carbon capture, there is no ongoing employment generated there. Those technologies are essentially functioning independently. It would also lock our region into a failing fossil fuel economy and prevent the creation of hundreds of thousands of clean energy jobs. Clean energy creates jobs, but carbon capture doesn't. Now let's move on to hydrogen. So what is hydrogen? It depends on what color of hydrogen you're talking about. So hydrogen's economic viability and carbon footprint depend on how it's produced. And there's a whole rainbow of different types of carbon that are being discussed today in the news. The one you'll hear most often likely is gray hydrogen, which is derived from methane, which can come from fracked natural gas. Gray hydrogen comprises almost all of the hydrogen produced in the US today, about 95%, and it results in significant carbon emissions, both upstream and downstream. So when you frack, that creates carbon emissions, and then when you produce gray hydrogen, that also creates emissions as well. Blue hydrogen is essentially the same thing as gray hydrogen, except it uses carbon capture technology to reduce the downstream emissions when the hydrogen is produced, rather. Because of its reliance on carbon capture, it hasn't been proven at scale. So it's something that is talked about a lot, but hasn't really been implemented at scale in the US. Green hydrogen is produced from water via electrolysis using renewable energy. And green hydrogen truly yields zero carbon emissions. So, it takes wind and solar power, it takes water, puts it through the process of electrolysis, and doesn't produce any emissions at all. So green hydrogen is something that we actually at the Ohio River Valley Institute are in favor of. It has certain niche industrial applications that we think can help work toward a decarbonized economy, which I'll talk about in just a moment. And lastly, pink and brown hydrogen. So pink hydrogen is created using nuclear energy. Brown hydrogen is produced via coal gasification. And those are rare forms of hydrogen that aren't discussed as much, but I thought I'd throw them in there just because. So this diagram shows how hydrogen is produced. So on the right here, you've got gray, blue, and green hydrogen, the three most common forms of hydrogen, or rather the three forms of hydrogen that are most discussed in energy circles. So gray and blue hydrogen both start with fossil fuel extraction. You frack natural gas from underground. That natural gas is then heated with steam produced by natural gas in a process known as steam reforming. Blue hydrogen then uses carbon capture and storage to redirect some of those carbon emissions. Gray hydrogen doesn't use carbon capture and storage and produces even more carbon emissions at the end result. And then electrolysis here is the process by which renewable energy splits hydrogen from water, yielding zero net carbon emissions. And that's how green hydrogen is produced. So how should hydrogen be used? There are certain applications for hydrogen which are economical and make sense in a decarbonizing economy. Those include heavy duty and long distance transportation, such as long haul trucking or aviation, as well as cement, steel, and other industrial uses that are really hard to electrify. Hydrogen only has a climate benefit for those uses if it eliminates or drastically reduces greenhouse gas emissions, which gray and blue hydrogen can't do. So really, these uses are only applicable for green hydrogen that's produced through electrolysis and doesn't create any additional carbon emissions. There are other hydrogen applications that are often discussed by politicians in the oil and gas industry, but that don't make economic sense. Those include light and medium duty transportation, so like hydrogen batteries for cars, utility scale electricity generation, and heating our homes and buildings. Even green hydrogen shouldn't be used for these applications because renewable energy like solar, like wind power, is just an easier and less expensive solution. Solar and wind energy prices are also falling dramatically and will outcompete many of hydrogen's possible applications here. So next, I'm going to go through some plans for hydrogen and carbon capture development. At the federal level, there have been many subsidies and incentives for carbon capture development that have come out within the last several months. There have been more than a dozen bills that have been introduced to Congress to promote carbon capture and storage. These bills would modify Section 45Q of the tax code to essentially make it easier for fossil fuel companies to deploy carbon capture and storage. They'd increase the value of tax credits, convert some of these credits into direct payments so that the ultimate subsidy isn't limited by your tax liability. They would allow for some corporate partnership arrangements that essentially make financing acquisitions easier, and they increase eligibility windows. There have also been some state and local measures encouraged by the White House Council on Environmental Quality to, again, incentivize carbon capture development. These include abatements of property and sales taxes, guaranteed offtake agreements, accelerated pipeline permitting, assumptions of financial liability by states, and the designation of carbon capture as a public good, which would essentially kind of enable or expedite public domain claims, or eminent domain claims rather. And there's also been a proposal to build out a national network of hydrogen hubs. So the 2021 bipartisan infrastructure law includes $8 billion for a fleet of these hydrogen hubs. It outlines 4 in particular. One has been designated for green hydrogen, but the other 3, which include one that has been proposed for construction in the Ohio River Valley, are designated as blue hydrogen. And again, that's the type of hydrogen that is derived from methane and uses carbon capture to reduce downstream carbon emissions. These hydrogen hubs would retrofit the carbon emitting facilities in the region, in the area, again, with this expensive and unproven carbon capture technology. And it would link all of these facilities with a sprawling network of pipelines to transport and then store the captured carbon. Proponents of these hubs say that they'll reduce carbon emissions and create jobs, but our research shows that that's unlikely to happen. Here's a diagram that kind of works to explain what these hydrogen hubs look like. So again, natural gas and coal are extracted from the earth. They're sent to gas and coal-fired power plants, as well as factories. Pipelines capture carbon from these facilities and either place them in an underground carbon sink or take them and are also used to create blue hydrogen, which proponents claim can be used for a variety of applications, which of course we've debunked just a moment ago, listed in this box on the lower left corner. So here's a map of projected hydrogen hub locations. This was created by the Great Plains Institute in February of 2022. As you can see here, these locations are places that have a high concentration of natural gas and coal-powered power facilities. They're likely candidates for where these four hydrogen hubs could end up locating. And this is just a quick map of what the carbon transport build-out could look like. So to connect all these facilities, again, we would need a massive network of carbon pipelines to take the captured carbon from the coal and gas-fired power facilities and other industrial facilities and transport it to these underground formations or depleted oil and gas fields where the carbon could then be stored. Of course, there are several problems with these regional blue hydrogen hubs. One of which is higher prices, which we've discussed already. So carbon capture is exorbitantly expensive in the power sector. And in the Ohio Valley, coal and gas power plants comprise a large part of the total emissions these hubs are meant to reduce. Because carbon capture is so expensive and because there are so many coal and gas-fired power plants in the region, it would likely require taxes or rate hikes in order to finance a massive infrastructure project like this. These hubs would also create little job growth or local prosperity. Again, once the construction is completed for these facilities, carbon capture technology doesn't create many permanent full-time jobs. And it also locks us into the natural gas economy in which we find ourselves now that really hasn't created as many jobs as proponents have claimed. It'll create more carbon emissions and localized pollution. So constructing this hydrogen hub would likely increase the amount of fracking and the amount of coal extraction in the Ohio River Valley because it allows these coal and gas-fired power plants to continue operating, to continue emitting, when really they should be shut down and replaced with renewable power generation. It also, the carbon capture used in the hydrogen hub would do nothing to address the localized air pollutants like nitrous oxide and volatile organic compounds that harm public health and the environment. And lastly, it's a diversion from better solutions. So clean energy and energy efficiency retrofits would create thousands of jobs and actually reduce carbon emissions in a way that these blue hydrogen hubs could not. Next, I'm going to go through a history of false promises. So if this hydrogen hub proposition seems familiar to you, it's likely because the oil and gas industry has been promoting similar mega infrastructure projects like this for almost a decade. Appalachia has been promised jobs and prosperity for years, but we're still waiting for those jobs and prosperity. the fracking boom failed to generate the hundreds of thousands of jobs that industry proponents claimed it would. The petrochemical cluster, which is still on its last legs right now in the Ohio River Valley, fizzled. Just one of 5 ethane cracker projects that were proposed for construction in the Ohio River Valley remains in motion. That's the Shell ethane cracker in Monaca, Pennsylvania. The Appalachian Storage Hub, which was a crucial part of the petrochemical build-out that was proposed a few years ago, also failed to materialize. Even so, the industry made out well because of lavish subsidies and regulatory favors. It's likely to be a similar case as the DOE prepares to disseminate $8 billion in grants for these hydrogen hubs. What it boils down to is that these plans for hydrogen and carbon capture development are just the latest in a line of industry ploys to prolong fossil fuel extraction. Really what these hubs do is give aging coal and gas-fired power plants a license to operate for another decade or 2 or 3, when really these facilities should be replaced by renewable energy generation if we really want to decarbonize the economy and create lasting economic prosperity in our region. So there's a better way to decarbonize. The solution is a regional and national transition to clean renewable energy generation, energy efficiency, and storage. And this motion would more completely reduce carbon emissions, and it would cost a little more for electricity than what we're paying now. So solar and wind power and other forms of renewable energy development, or renewable energy generation rather, have fallen drastically in price over the last several years. They're much more cost competitive than even maintaining coal and natural gas fired facilities. This transition would also create far more jobs than carbon capture retrofits or regional hydrogen hubs, particularly in coal and natural gas dependent economies that have been struggling for almost a decade with the fracking boom. It'll also avoid prolonging the oil and gas industry and all of the carbon emissions that the industry generates, both upstream in terms of fracking and downstream in terms of power generation. And it will truly eliminate the hazardous localized air pollution and quality of life impacts caused by oil and gas production. So thanks so much for your time today. That's just a quick overview of the Ohio River Valley Institute's research on hydrogen and carbon capture. I'm happy to provide some links to studies, events, some recordings of webinars that we've hosted that go into more detail about the finances and the economics behind hydrogen and carbon capture, as well as some other resources we have on renewable energy generation and a transition to a cleaner economy. I'm happy to take any questions, and if I can't answer them, I'm also happy to relay them to our research team at the Ohio River Valley Institute. So thanks for your time.
Thanks so much, Ben. That was a great presentation, and I hope that people got a lot out of it. There's so much to learn in this whole new realm that we're dealing with, and so this was a great overview and a great view of the economics of it. I wanted to put into the chat that Ben had mentioned that there's a CEQ has been working on this. That's the Council of Environmental Quality at the White House, and they actually have a comment period open right now regarding their guidance on how to implement CCUS. And so I'm just going to put the link into the chat just in case anybody can submit comments to express your concerns about doing this at all or your concerns with the particulars. So I'm putting that there right now, and then we're going to turn to your questions because we have gotten a few. Wanted to start with the first question that had come in. Have the dangers of using hydrogen been considered?
Yeah, absolutely, Michael. So that's a great question. And that's something that our research doesn't delve into as much because we are mostly focused on the economic side of things, and we try to supplement research on the environmental and public health dangers of hydrogen with that kind of research. But there are absolutely dangers of producing and of producing hydrogen. It's a very volatile compound. Transporting it can be really dangerous, and it's liable to again to pipeline ruptures. There are faults in the production process that could be pretty catastrophic.
Thank you. And before we turn to the next question, I saw in the chat that Kirk asked about the comment period, saying that it's closed. That's the EQ comment period I just mentioned. The link that I put into the chat is the link to the current way to submit comments. What they did was extend it, but when they extended it, they let the first comment period close and then opened a whole new portal for it. And so if you go to their website, you're going to click on Federal Register to find the way to submit comments. You're going to hit the wrong link very likely. So please hang on to the link here. The comment period closes April 18th. Okay, I'm sorry for that distraction, but let me get back to the questions. How problematic is a particular Appalachian Senator Manchin from West Virginia with respect, and in quotes around D, West Virginia, with respect to alternate energy matters?
Quite, yeah. So Manchin has been a big proponent of these hydrogen hubs, and it has also just been a roadblock to alternative energy development, of course. Although he actually, so in a statement several months ago, he himself acknowledged that carbon capture is a particularly expensive and unproven solution. But even still, he's a big proponent of these hydrogen hubs, and we've been, trying our best to kind of shift public opinion otherwise and raise awareness about why these hydrogen hubs are not a good idea for West Virginia or for the Ohio River Valley as a whole.
Can you talk in general, because it's not just Manchin, could you just kind of give the political layout of how this is going right now, where the parties are in general?
Yeah, of course. So unfortunately, these hydrogen hubs are supported in a bipartisan manner, both at the federal level and at the local level and state level. So Democrats see hydrogen and carbon capture as a technological innovation that can be used to decarbonize the economy. And they haven't, I think that what we're trying to do is make folks aware that these technologies aren't proven and they are worse ways to decarbonize than a more expedited transition to clean and renewable resources. So it's really frustrating that, yeah, the Biden administration is the one who essentially outlined the funding for these projects, and at the state and local level, we're still trying to convince Democrats that this project is a bad idea.
Thanks. Now, Adam asks, do you have any further details on plans for the Ohio River Valley Hydrogen Hub?
Yeah, so that was outlined about a month ago, maybe a little over a month ago, by a group of 7 oil and gas producers, which include EQT, Equinor, Shell is a part of this venture. And there haven't been many details publicly released about the hub. We are keeping a close eye on any news surrounding, what it will look like, where the funding will come from. But we do assume that they are submitting an application to the Department of Energy for this $8 billion funding allocation for developing hydrogen hubs. It's likely to be a blue hydrogen hub, that we do know.
And can you talk about that for a second? Because what I've noticed here in Pennsylvania is that they'll propose something as green hydrogen, but when you start reading the details, they say, well, that might be coming or something like that. It's almost like a bait and switch. So can you talk about that and if that's been the case elsewhere?
Absolutely, yeah. So that has been the case elsewhere, and it's partially because green hydrogen isn't quite market ready yet. It's not as cost effective as gray hydrogen or potentially even blue hydrogen, depending on the cost of carbon capture. So a lot of it's an easy out, right, for fossil fuel companies to say, yeah, we're creating this facility where we are, moving to decarbonize by producing green hydrogen, when in fact they are really referring to blue hydrogen that uses carbon capture to reduce the downstream carbon emissions, but does nothing to address the upstream carbon emissions generated from fracking or methane extraction. And these terms, the different colors of hydrogen, are thrown around pretty loosely, unfortunately, by the industry and in the media. So many times when fossil fuel companies in particular refer to green hydrogen, they could really be doing exactly what you're saying, Karen, kind of baiting folks with greenwashing ploy, saying that this is zero emissions, when in fact it'll really just kind of extend or prolong fracking upstream.
And Alan asked a question about clean nuclear power. What about that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Alan. So at the Ohio River Valley Institute, we are in favor of keeping nuclear power plants open for as long as possible, or rather, existing nuclear power plants shouldn't be closed because we don't want them to be replaced with fossil fuel production, oil and gas, which is what has happened in many instances. Clean nuclear power can be a part of the energy transition, but we haven't done a ton of research on what exactly that would look like. And solar and hydropower, wind power are likely the most cost-effective way to decarbonize the economy.
Adam asks, do you know if Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania have existing regulatory frameworks for carbon capture and storage? He's aware of West Virginia seeking EPA primacy on Class 6 injection wells, injection well permitting, and wondered if Pennsylvania and Ohio are doing the same.
Yeah, that's a great question, Adam. So what Adam is referring to about the Class 6 injection wells, so those are injection wells that would be used to store carbon underground. They are used to inject carbon underground. And a handful of states, including West Virginia, Louisiana, and Texas, are seeking primacy to kind of expedite the permitting of those wells. So currently, the US EPA is the one who grants permits for Class 6 wells across the nation. But these states want to take that jurisdiction themselves so that they can kind of expedite the process and accelerate the production of these hydrogen hubs. And to answer your question, Adam, I am not aware of Ohio and Pennsylvania seeking primacy as of yet, but we are keeping our eye on the progress of those applications.
And Pennsylvania was, I think, of those states, the only one that was part of the CO2 Regional Transport Plan that was run by the Great Plains Institute. And so I can find that link and share it while you're answering questions if anybody's interested in seeing that report that came out in October. June asks, I had not heard about the Netherlands study that shows 32 of 40 CC projects they reviewed increased emissions. What is the name of the study, and can you put a link in the chat?
Yeah, absolutely. So that I'm afraid I don't know the name of the study offhand, but it just came out within the last couple of weeks. So I'm happy to find a link to that and put it in the chat as well. It's pretty shocking, pretty stunning.
And Sean says, great presentation, Ben, and asks if you can see that mechanical CDR costs can go down as operations scale, similar to price drops that we've seen with wind and solar.
Yeah, Sean, that's a great question. And frankly, I think I would kick that one back to the researchers at the Ohio River Valley Institute. I'm personally not sure off the top of my head. It could, but I would want to just run that back to our researchers and confirm with them. But thanks for the question.
And Faith asks, is there some reason I don't see Karen's link to open comment period? So I will put that back into the chat, and so you can catch it there. And Mary's saying the same thing. We also have a question about hydrogen generating devices that are available commercially, which operate on distilled water. Are those units economically viable to use? Do you know?
That's a good question. Yeah, I'm afraid I'm not sure about that either. I think that it's these hydrogen project, the mega infrastructure hydrogen projects on a larger scale. Those are going to be kind of driving the conversation about the cost effectiveness of hydrogen, and so that's what we're keeping a closer eye on. But commercial hydrogen generating devices is something that we can also look into as well.
And we have a question from Randy. How can we get this information into the public aside from writing LTEs and op-eds? Local media is only a cheerleader for CCS.
Yeah, isn't that the truth, Randy? That's something that we are working on and thinking about at Orvi as well. So LTEs and op-eds are one of our primary channels of public outreach. Our executive director, Joanne Kilgour, just published an op-ed in the Philadelphia Inquirer about these regional carbon capture and hydrogen hubs, in which she outlines, the problems with carbon capture and hydrogen hubs, as well as alternatives that are more effective and efficient ways to decarbonize. We've also been meeting with local elected officials. We've been meeting with journalists who work in the Ohio River Valley to just kind of have a sit-down face-to-face conversation with them and talk with them about what these could mean for the valley, because this is it's high-level stuff that we're talking about. Some of it's over my head. It's complicated, and distilling this information into something that's that makes sense to people is something that's really important, and something that we're working on pretty actively.
Okay. Susanna asks, what is your support for small modular reactors?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we actually, there's a divide at the Ohio River Valley Institute. We have a few researchers who are in favor and some who have questions about both the economic viability and the environmental repercussions of small modular reactors. We do think that there is some viability there, but that's something that we haven't done a lot of research on ourselves.
And let's see. I'm seeing some things that are more comments than questions.
While you're looking, Karen, I just want to share that we'll be downloading the chat and sending out all the links in a follow-up email to everyone who's registered, so don't worry about trying to keep up with the chat in live time.
Thank you. June makes a comment, the analogy to wind and solar is a false analogy. There's no market when you bury your product. Captured carbon, there's no financial exchange value created when your product is disposed of. The correct analogy is to waste disposal. Any thought on that?
Yeah, that's a good point, June. You're right that there is no market when you bury your product. So the comparison that we're trying to make here is that as an avenue for decarbonization, carbon capture is far inferior to other forms of decarbonization, like wind and solar energy generation, which do create jobs, and as a means of decarbonization, they are much more economically fruitful than carbon capture and storage.
So
I hope that answered your question. Yeah.
I wondered if you could talk about what's going on, once again, in the political landscape with all of the LNG, talk about, supplying Ukraine and Europe with, unleashing Pennsylvania's gas is how it's been referred to here. But we've wondered if that means that it just creates like an opening for people who are proponents of CCS to say, and this is the way we make LNG green. Are there concerns about that on your end?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, yeah, as you're saying, oil and gas companies have entirely capitalized on the crisis in Ukraine to promote more fossil fuel production, more fracking, more drilling, more oil and gas in general. And it's given them such a powerful soapbox and a microphone to talk about these issues and to reframe oil and gas in a way that we've been trying to work against for months and years. So So we do worry that it gives them new renewed license to talk about carbon capture and hydrogen as a way to simultaneously address the crisis in Ukraine by producing more oil while making it green with carbon capture technology. So it's something that we are trying to contextualize and reframe. And our position is that we don't need more oil and gas drilling. We need more renewable energy generation that isn't reliable or that isn't dependent rather on foreign markets and subject to global price fluctuations.
And, the Voices Coalition that's hosting this today, and we're going to be doing one of these the second Friday of every month at 10 a.m. So if you're interested, please let us know that you'd like to be informed when we're doing these, and we'll be announcing speakers as we go. But, it's been a pipeline group. We've been working on FERC-regulated pipelines for many years now, and so one of the things that drew our attention to this issue was the fact that, of course, it's going to mean a network of CO2 pipelines, and so I just wondered if you wanted to talk about that at all. I know we're both part of a national group that's that includes people who are in parts of the country where they're already fighting these pipelines, and there are companies, there are sort of new players to a lot of us, like Summit and companies like that. So I just wondered if you wanted to talk at all about the pipeline piece of this.
Yeah, absolutely. So pipelines are a critical component of these hubs, right? The blue and green hydrogen hubs that have been proposed by the Department of Energy, or that funding has been made available through the Department of Energy. But again, the construction of these carbon capture pipelines doesn't make sense if the carbon capture technology itself isn't economically viable, particularly in the power sector. So if you are looking to, retrofit your inventory of coal and natural gas-fired power plants with carbon capture technology, and then construct pipelines to transport that captured carbon to sinks, to the underground, storage caverns where it'd be sequestered nominally permanently, but we don't know about that. Then it doesn't make sense to build the pipelines if the technology itself isn't economic to construct.
And one of the things to look out for, I know in Ohio you knew all too well about receiving our waste from fracking,
Right.
and and what we've always been told here is that our geology isn't conducive to having injection wells. And then they changed that. Our geology apparently changed, and they started proposing them. But it turns out that our DCNR, that's our Department of Conservation and Natural Resources here, has been looking at these issues for 2 decades. We found out, and they were primarily looking at places where this stuff could be stored. And some of us, including a fellow with the Frack Tracker who used to work for DCNR, have been expressing concerns about the fact that it's DCNR doing that they might be trying to put this through public lands, our state lands. So that's where they would try to propose the pipelines, and that's where they might try to store some of this stuff. And I'm just wondering if you've had anything on your radar about that. Have there been those similar kinds of discussions anywhere that you're aware of about, who's really going to be sort of leading this, and would it be things like, using our state lands for running these pipelines, or is that just here?
That's a great question. Yeah, I'm not aware of any similar efforts in Ohio, but your allusion to fracking waste is a great point. So that's another. That would be another result of implementing hydrogen and carbon capture, is that, if we allow the fossil fuel industry to continue, if we kind of prolong its social license to operate with these technologies, that generates more fracking, and it generates more fracking waste. And as you've alluded to, it's a huge problem in Ohio, which imports a lot of fracking waste from Pennsylvania and West Virginia. Where it's injected underground and causes a whole host of public health and environmental problems. These injection wells similar to captured carbon injection, are liable to leaks. They, you know, if the rock layer isn't fully non-porous or isn't, fully non-porous, these wastes can escape and damage water supplies. They can injure public health, things like that.
And Kirk has a question. What do you have to say about California deployment of FCEV cars and why China and South Korea are targeting more than 1 million FCEV vehicles by 2040?
Yeah, Kirk, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with the acronym FCEV. Yeah.
Yeah, could you maybe explain that, Kirk, in another comment? And while you're doing that, I am going to put into the chat that at 11:30 today, if you are, really eager to be on lots of webinars in the same day, but you should register for it because it would be recorded and you could watch it later if you don't have time today. But there's going to be another webinar related to all of this that is being hosted by PSR, Physicians for Social Responsibility, and it features a number of the folks who are part of the national team that Ben and I are also part of. And so I'm going to put the link to that in the chat so that you can sign up for it if you're interested. But it's called Examining Carbon Capture Through a Public Health and Environmental Justice Lens. So it's another slant on all of this. So again, even if you can't attend but you're interested in getting the recording, I would say register for it. And that starts at 11:30. And so I'm looking to see if Kirk is explained FCEV, hydrogen fuel cell cars. Yeah.
Yeah. So thanks, Kirk. I appreciate that clarification. So the thing with hydrogen fuel cell cars is that it's in most cases it's much more economical and more efficient to instead kind of expand electric vehicle production that is, like rechargeable batteries that can be, that can be charged using renewable energy. So that that obviously first entails an expansion of renewable energy sources that are not carbon emitting in order for those EVs to be truly net zero. But that we think is in the long term the more both economically efficient and in terms of the physics behind it, the energy generation is more efficient as well.
And I also wanted to note that before we decided to start doing this regularly, we did touch on CCS in another one of our webinars that I hope Bridget can share when she sends out the links, because back to the pipeline issue for a second, Dan Ziegert, who's part of the Climate Investigation Center, did a really important report for HuffPo. And it was on gassing Satarsha, a small town actually, in Mississippi, where a CO2 pipeline exploded. And it's not exactly the same kind of CO2 pipeline we're talking about now, but it is the first evidence of like a really bad disaster related to a CO2 pipeline. So it's a sort of a cautionary tale for what could be coming. And so I would recommend anybody read that HuffPo piece, gassing Satarsha. And like I said, I hope Bridget can share the presentation that Dan did for us a couple of months ago. While I've been saying that, I've been looking for more questions. I'm not seeing any, but if you have any additional questions, feel free to put them into the chat because we have a few minutes left. And in the meantime, I wanted to ask also about like the you talked about the fuel cell the fuel standards for in California that have been a great debate, but we're also talking about an alternative fuel tax, like these incentives at the federal level that have not been renewed, but that seems to be, a lot of this is hinging on that. So it seems like a lot of subsidies are required for these companies to move forward. You know, the one that we're looking at here in Pennsylvania isn't specific to CCS, but it includes it, and that's that Nacero gas to gasoline plant. That seems to be the way to start introducing these things now, is to also throw in blue hydrogen and CCS as sort of the, you know, icing on top, you know, as the cherry on top, so that it's even got more appeal and it seems greener. But it seems like there's this sort of lack of real capital, and you know, for all the money going into it, it seems like when these projects are proposed, they're absolutely dependent on subsidies coming forth to really finance them. And so is it that much of a shell game?
That's right. Yeah. So these hydrogen and carbon capture hubs, as we've been discussing, are not economically viable without billions in government subsidies, because carbon capture it's not a market ready technology. It doesn't you know, it doesn't make sense for these coal and gas fired power plant owners to retrofit their facilities with carbon capture unless they are being incentivized to do so, and unless the technology itself is being financed, because it just adds so much to the operating cost. It would essentially make them no longer market competitive without loads of government subsidies.
And we have a question from Rachel. Are you speaking with economists and investors in energy similar to the face-to-face conversations mentioned earlier?
Yeah, that's a great question. We haven't done much outreach to energy investors. We do have some economists who are on our board of advisors, including some folks at Carnegie Mellon University, at Pitt University as well. There's a full list of those folks on our website. But yeah, that's a great idea, and something that, you know, it's a conversation that needs to be had as well. There's a lot of misconception about carbon capture and hydrogen.
And with just a few minutes left, I see a couple people have been noting that the chat seems to be disabled, so that they don't think we're going to get more questions, but actually here in Q&A, so if you look at the bottom of your screen, you see the Q&A button. This is where we've been trying to take all the questions. So like I had said earlier in the chat that you probably didn't see, but that it's easier to find rather than trying to sort through comments people are making. So if you're trying to ask a question, that's the button to click on. We just have a few more minutes left, but if you haven't had a chance to ask because you thought you needed to do it there, please type it in here. We'll try to get to it. And then I also wanted to touch on the fact that, you know, we are, again, in this sort of moment where so much money is being invested into this thing. And is it something that, you know, some people have said in some various groups that I'm part of, including that one that I keep mentioning that's a national team that we're part of, but I've heard it elsewhere too, that it seems like at the federal level it's almost sort of fait accompli, and that the place to fight these fights is in the states as projects are proposed. How do you feel about that? Do you think it's something that we still could be fighting at the federal level effectively, or is it really now a matter of the states taking on these projects and kind of defeating it?
It's an uphill battle for sure at both the state and the federal levels. But we at Orvi have been fortunate to get a few audiences with the Department of Energy to discuss this kind of stuff. So our senior researcher, Sean O'Leary, who did a lot of the research, most of the research that was included in my presentation, has presented before several folks in the Department of Energy, folks who are, you know, pretty staunch proponents of hydrogen and carbon capture. And of course, convincing anybody to change their position on something is difficult, especially when it's energy related. But we think that particularly now, before the applications for these hydrogen hubs are submitted, there's still a window there to try to move the DOE. So that's what we've been working on at the federal level, is again just trying to get meetings with Department of Energy officials and disseminate our research there. And then at the state level, we're also just trying to continue to make connections with folks we've again set up some meetings with state legislators in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, and just trying to get our research, our information out there prior to the full application, or I'm sorry, the closure of the application period for these facilities.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
Alan asked, new thorium reactors are a kind of clean nuclear. Have you heard of it?
No, I have not, Alan. I'm sorry. Thorium, yeah.
And let's see. And there's another question about nuclear, and since we're talking about carbon capture and storage, I think I'll let that pass. But
I appreciate that, yeah.
are there any final questions for Ben on the topic we're discussing today, carbon capture and storage? If not, we're about 3 minutes until 11, and so I want to take this opportunity to thank you so much, Ben, for doing this. Really appreciate all that excellent information you provided us with today. I'm so grateful for the work you're doing at the Ohio River Valley Institute as well.
Thank you, Karen, and thanks everybody in attendance. I appreciate your time today. And yeah, I apologize if there are any questions that I haven't been able to answer. Please feel free to email me. My email, I'll drop it in the chat, is ben@ohiorivervalleyinstitute.org. And I can forward your questions or comments or concerns to our team of researchers who might be able to better answer them. So thanks again for your time. I appreciate it, and good to see you all.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Bridget, for driving. We'll see everybody next month on the second Friday when we'll be doing another one of these webinars on carbon capture and storage. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.